as one of the world's worst drawers, I think it's absolutely crucial that I draw in front of you guys. So here's my little character. And this little character, I don't know, let's call him Kelvin, who the hell knows why. But here's my little character, and Kelvin wants to do some aerobic training, right? What a drawing that is. Now what Kelvin's going to do here is he's going to go and participate in that wonderful type of training that is continuous training. And he's going to set off, and he's going to go on, let's say, some run. It could be a cycle, for example. But what are the characteristics that he needs to follow to make this continuous training effective? That's really where I want to get to. And here's point number one. The training must be at least or greater than 20 minutes. So there's my greater than sign, or at least my attempt at it. And I'm saying it's got to be greater than 20 minutes. That's one of the characteristics that defines continuous training. Anything less than that cannot be counted as continuous training. Secondly, is it can be, and often is, up to 2 hours. Okay, so continuous training is at 2 hours. Now, it can technically go longer than that, but we use the figure of 2 hours, or 120 minutes, because that is, generally speaking, on average, the limit of glycogen stores that a human being will store in their liver, in their muscle glycogen store. Okay, so therefore, that's what we tend to use as a bit of a guidance figure there. So, what about the intensity? That's the time factor, right? So that's the first T of fit, for example. But what about the I, the intensity of this? Well, we'd expect this training to be between 60 to 80% max HR. So in other words, this is a sub-maximal event. But can I just stress to you that very frequently good athletes will be up at 85%. So whilst we are using the figures of 60 to 80%, can I just stress to you the real world reality, which is that people do go up to 85%. Now, of course, anything above that, we're likely to be in the zone of VO2 max. Anything above that, we're likely to be into anaerobic work and producing lactic acid and working towards obla. So that's, of course, something we want to avoid. We're also saying for Kelvin here that, as I mentioned before, he's likely to be doing this with running. It could be cycling. It could be, for example, walking. Don't forget that walking is a form of continuous training. And it's something that you guys probably don't think is particularly important at your age, but when you get a bit older, it's kind of useful, right? Now, there are some positives here. The positives are that it's simple. So that's a real lovely strength of this. It's also cheap. You know, generally speaking, this requires a pair of trainers, and then you get out your front door and then you're away. The other thing that's really positive about this method is it's available to all. So this is a really open access method. You do not need an expensive gym membership for this, although some people do that and go on the treadmill, of course. But there are naturally some drawbacks. So what are the weaknesses of our continuous training? Why would someone perhaps find something else? Well, people report that it's tedious. You know, you've probably come across this notion of tedium and the importance of variety, type of exercise and variance, but it can be a little bit tedious. The other thing is it's time consuming. And we're going to come back to that. Going out and running or cycling for 2 hours is a chunk, right? I mean, that's going to take some time. The other point is that people claim that it reduces speed. So because it's one-paced and you're not doing a lot of change of intensity, unlike, let's say, fartlek training, it might reduce your speed. And the other thing is, we can argue that it leads to chronic injuries. Now, a classic example would be a runner developing something like a stress fracture of the tibia. It can lead to certain chronic injuries. So we describe these as perhaps, you know, some fairly negative aspects of this. Now, we want to look at different types of training. So if I go back to me man Kelvin, I guess he's a man. Here's Kelvin again. Now Kelvin, he's gone out of his front door again. Here he is, right? And this time he's going to go on some training again. But this time what he's going to do, he's going to run, he's going to stop, he's going to run, he's going to stop, he's going to run, he's going to stop, and so on. Now, you probably realise that I'm describing interval training here, but I want to specifically bring your attention to the notion of high intensity, I don't know why I did it like this, interval training. I made work for myself there by using different colours, but I just want to bring that point to you. This is, at the end of the day, folks, HIIT training, okay? That's what we are talking about here. It's a HIIT training, and we want to look at the mechanics of this HIIT training, what it is. First of all, I'm going to define it for you. It is periods, and we could say actually intermittent periods, of high intensity work and recovery. Now, I've written it that way, of high intensity work and recovery. Now, I've written that way because I think this really summarises it. Do you notice? I could say periods of high intensity work and periods of recovery. No, I want you to get the idea that the recovery is also high intensity. You might be thinking, hang on a minute, Jimbo, what are you on about? The recovery is high intensity. You're standing there doing that. Well, that is true. But the point I want to make here is that the aerobic development comes in the recovery phase. And that's really the whole point with HIIT training. So, couple of factors. First of all, we'd expect it to be something like 20 to 60 minutes. And by the way, there are models of HIIT that can be as little as 5 minutes. We'd expect this person to be doing something like 4 to 10 sets of their work, and each of those sets having something like 10 repetitions. So I've only illustrated 4 repetitions here, but it might be that there's 10 repetitions and they do a set of those maybe like 8 times, for example. And the work relief ratio is typically 1 to 0.5. Now let me be clear here. That means, or we could also say 1 to 2. We could also say 2 to 1. If you actually get my maths not terrible. So what I mean by that is that if we use the bottom example, for every period of work that they do, they have half that time in recovery. Okay, so they're working twice as long as they are recovering. Now that comes back to the high intensity recovery I mentioned before. Now let us get into our positives. What's our strength to this method? Well, it actually burns more calories. So it is actually a higher intensity workout as a result. We get we get faster adaptations from this method compared to continuous training. Also, it brings the athlete into what might be called their competitive performance intensity. In other words, they're training, especially if they're a games player, they're training like they are competing. We could call that near transfer if it was a sports psychology thing. We're also getting quicker sessions, or if you like, it's more time efficient. Therefore, maybe it becomes tedious less. But also, this is such an interesting one. Well, in my opinion. I said that as if it was interesting, like hot chocolate. I suppose not that interesting. Athletes of different levels together. And what I mean by this is that because of the nature of this, you don't need 2 people jogging at the same, or doing continuous training at the same pace. You can actually work on something like an athletics track, and everyone can work at their own intensity, and people of a very different level can work together. As an example of this, I've personally gone and watched my 10-year-old daughter, 16 now, and I've literally watched her training through HIIT training on the track, and right next to her is an Olympic 1500, 3000 metre and marathon runner who's competing in 3 different Olympic games. And that's the point I'm trying to make, and that's a very, very interesting notion when you come to that sort of notion of inspiration and sort of progressiveness. Anyway, I hope that's useful for you. Aerobic training. Thanks.